I want to welcome everyone to our second Pastor Church Resources conversation panel discussion around difficult conversations your church may be having around COVID. And we know a lot of churches are experiencing increased tension, conflict right now, as there's different groups kind of pulling in different ways, different impulses at play. And one of the tools that we have found helpful at Pastor Church Resources is polarity analysis. And so we'll say more about that in a minute. But I invited Cecil, VanNiejenhuis, and Postma to be with us today to explain a little bit of how polarities might help your church navigate some of these difficult conversations right now. So I would just want to introduce Al first. So Al's a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. He has been since 2009. He served a congregation in Thunder Bay, Bethlehem Christian Reformed Church, before transitioning to work with the Christian Reformed denomination on Classis Renewal, especially. And so he's seen the importance of good process and good decision-making at the council level and also the Classis level. And then Cecil VanNiejenhuis, who's been a minister in the Christian Reformed Church since 1981. He's served congregations in Ancaster, Lacombe, Kitchener, and Edmonton. Did I get them all, Cecil?
You did.
Yeah. Before transitioning about 10, 11 years ago to Pastor Church Resources as a ministry consultant. And now he's the co-director of PCR. And while pastoring in Ontario and Alberta, you also served as a church visitor frequently. And so you've been in and out of lots of different council rooms, lots of different Classis meetings. And so I think both of you have a sense of how these conversations might be playing out in congregations across the US and Canada. So I really thank you for your time today and for sharing some of your wisdom and perspective on how polarity analysis might help our churches right now. Cecil, I'm going to start with you. Just tell us about polarity analysis and how it can help a council kind of understand the decision they need to make.
Okay. Yeah. Let me just frame it this way. There's a difference between problems that we can solve and problems that are solvable, and polarities, which cannot be solved but can only be managed. And what I mean is this: problems are usually, there's a real focus to them, and there's a solution. For example, you can have some that have a clear solution. If you've got a pothole in your parking lot or a leak in your roof, you've got a problem. And there's a solution, and you can fix it. And so it's kind of there, you identify it, and then you're done. And you know it's the right one. Sometimes you get into a really nice situation where there may be multiple solutions, and then you've got a choice to make. You still have a decision to make, but it's a choice. There's not a wrong choice. There's just different ones, and so take some of the pressure off. But there are also often occasions especially for church councils, where we have decisions to make. We can be tempted to think about them as we've got a problem and we need to find a solution. And so thinking there might be a correct answer to this situation. And what's more challenging and making the story a little thicker and more complicated is the fact that you may be dealing with something that has some competing values that are playing out and holding each other a little bit in tension. And so, for example, you might think that it's either this or that. We have to choose between two options. And sometimes it's not about an either or, but it's about saying, there are two or at least two things in play here. Let me give you an example. For example, when we speak with each other, we need to be honest with each other, and we need to be kind with each other. Those are both really important values. And if you had to choose just one or just the other, you would be falling short of what the best approach would be. Because if it's just truth, it can be quite brutal. And if it's just kindness, it might not be very honest and or very helpful in the end. So you need to be both at the same time. And the hard thing is, so Now, you make decisions at a given point, and sometimes you have to tilt a little bit more towards the honesty side, sometimes a little bit more towards the kindness side, but you're holding those things in an ongoing conversation. Here's the thing about polarities. When I say, for example, that in a council room there are certain things that are not either or decisions, but they're both and. So not either honesty or kindness, but both honesty and kindness. When we start talking about the fact that there are two things that we have to hold together and you can't make a one or the other, black or white choice, sometimes council members get a little nervous and think we're getting a little relativistic, we're getting a little wishy-washy. And I want to say this, that the background for thinking about polarities is, one is very creational. It's the way we're made, actually, as human beings, as living beings. Here's a fundamental polarity. We inhale and we exhale. We need oxygen, so we breathe in. But then we get all this CO2 right inside of us, and we have to breathe it out. There has to be an exhale. You cannot choose to do just one or just the other. You have to do both. You can't just be an active person or a person at rest. You need activity and rest, and they need to balance and hold each other, in a kind of a conversation, an ongoing conversation. So that's one way to think about that. And so polarities, one of the things about them is that you can have two values that are both very significant and important, and both of them have to be considered and weighed out. How you do that, you can only manage that. You can't solve it. So here's the thing about polarities. When you have two seemingly opposite values that put you in a dilemma, how do you deal with both of these things? Because there will be people arguing for one side and others arguing for another side. And you're saying, hold on, both of these are important. So the thing about these is that they are interdependent. Like honesty and kindness need each other. They can't stand alone, because if they stand alone, they're incomplete, which is a hugely important piece here. They're interdependent. They're indestructible. You'll never, ever get rid of them. You're always, every single decision you make, you are going to be living within some of those polarities. And you can't manage them. Yeah, you can find out. Anyway, you just have to live with both of them. So that's the context within which we make decisions. But you still have to make decisions, right? One other interesting thing. Let me just, and that's why this is really important for decision times in councils, is that when you have two opposite truths, shall we say, two opposite statements that are both true and right, what do you do? How do you deal with them? I often go back to the scripture, to Proverbs 26, 4 and 5, where there are two proverbs that follow each other and that are opposite. The first one says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will become like him. Or no, this is where I'm getting the text mixed up. But one says, do not answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes. The other one says, answer a fool according to his follies. But there's two opposite instructions. And the whole section in Proverbs 26 is about fittingness. There's all these different proverbs, and you have to know which one fits the situation. So do you answer a fool or do you not answer a fool according to their folly? Well, you need to judge the situation and determine what to do. So the fellow that showed me that for the first time, a prof, said, he who knows one proverb, only one, knows none. Because you have to know this proverb and you have to know its opposite. And then you have to be left with the situation. Okay, now I have to discern which one fits. And I think decision-making has very much to do with being wise and discerning in the moment and weighing some things out. And it's not about solving a problem. It's about saying, how do we move forward in this situation given these competing values, both of which are really good? That's a start.
Yeah. Al, is there any more background that you would want to offer as to what a polarity is? And then I definitely want to get into examples, because I think that's really where it's going to hit the ground for people.
Sure. one of the ways, another context piece that is just helpful for those of you who are visual thinkers is, I mean, you can probably Google this, look up polarity mapping, but it's sort of like a box with 4 quadrants, and you have one, you know, there's the left side and right side, and on the top is the value, and on the bottom is the fear. And if you look at a mapping, the natural direction of them is it goes in a figure 8. So you naturally go from the fear to the value, to the fear, to the value, to the fear, to the value. And it's not simply a fear, but it's a fear of an overfocus of the one to the neglect of the other. Right. And that's what seems to happen in most cases where things get very polarized, or, you know, people are living within a polarity without even realizing it, is oftentimes they're living within the fear rather than in the value. And so, you know, as an example, like, I forget the example you gave, Cecil, but
it's kindness, kindness and honesty.
Okay, kindness and honesty. What can happen is if someone values kindness predominantly, and they see someone who values honesty predominantly, both are interdependent and both need to be supported and achieved for a good conversation to happen. But the person who values kindness, if they're valuing it in such a way that they fear losing kindness, they very quickly look at any affirmation of honesty as something that pulls against kindness. And so someone who values honesty will say, we should just have more honesty in our conversation. And if someone is far on the other side of the pole and living within the fear of losing kindness, they often don't feel like they have the space to affirm the value of honesty, because by affirming the value of honesty, they feel like they're giving up the value of kindness. And so one of the challenges in polarity management, and one of the values in polarity management itself, is creating this sort of space where people can value each side of a polarity in such a way that does not feel like it's negating or living into the fear of the overfocused. So if I value kindness, what does it look like for me to value honesty, or at least to hear the person who is simply saying, I value honesty, and not hear them as living in this overfocus of honesty to the neglect of kindness. So that's one of the tensions in polarity management. Typically when you see it functioning in an unhealthy way, it's two sides that are living on the bottom side. They're living into the fear that their value will be neglected unless they hold on to it doggedly. And the ironic part is, the more that each side holds on to it tightly without being able to affirm the other piece of the polarity, is the further apart they'll get, and the less likely they will be to actually achieve a conversation. If your kindness, the less likely you're able to have a conversation where kindness is truly embedded and important in that conversation. So polarity management, one of the ways I find it really helpful as well is, if you know that system, that it's fear and value based, one of the parts to it is, disappointments and complaints, I'd love to say, are values in disguise. They're just negatively stated values. So we often don't hear people say as articulately and as clearly, I really value kindness. Right? They'll say, this is way too honest. This is like this, that they'll complain that people are outspoken, or someone who you know is really honest. They won't say, I really value honesty. They'll say, wow, this is like, we're walking on eggshells here, and you're like, what, you know? So they'll complain. But one of the things that we can do is we can help people shift their negatively stated value out of a complaint into a positively stated value itself. And that can be really formative even. And it often, I mean, in a lot of our, for some of us, our upbringing, for some of us, the churches we're part of, for some of us within our cultures, we're often not trained, if you want to use that word. We're often not trained to be able to really stand on our own 2 feet and say, this is something I value. And so we only know how to state what we desire by complaining. And so we can transform some of those complaints into their desires and allow the space to be in conversation about them.
Yeah. Cecil, you want to say more about that?
A little bit. You just sparked a few things for me. One is that the distinction between polarities and problems to solve is that what happens when you have a polarity, let's just say honesty and kindness. Again, there's positives to honesty, right? And there's positives to kindness. And if there's too much kindness and not enough honesty, there's a downside there. And there's a downside if we're too focused on truth and not on. When we treat a polarity as if it were a problem to solve, what it means is instead of moving back and forth between these things in this, figure 8 on the side, right, this infinity loop, we park in one of those spots and we stop moving. And that's when we treat it like a problem to solve. So when, for example, we say, we've been way too kind, it's time we stood up for the truth. And what we do is we move from being kind, we move over to the truth side and park there, and then suddenly it's all about truth. And the challenge is to keep moving between them. So, and the last thing I was going to say was that most of us have an instinctive default. Like, I'm more inclined to be honest, you might be more inclined to be kind, or vice versa. And so if that's true, then I can easily see the upsides of honesty. And if I see the upsides of honesty easily, I will easily see the downsides of kindness. And if I see the upsides of kindness, I will automatically easily see the downsides of honesty. And that's why we demonize the other side so often. So then your point about how we state things is right on.
And it's the beauty of being part of community, because, I mean, this really comes out, if we only ever talk to ourselves, yeah, we'll probably land in one spot and stay there. But it's when we're in community that, like you're saying, Cecil, different people have different values. And so we want people to value both. But I mean, I don't think that I ever expect someone to always value honesty and kindness right down the middle all the time. And so when I start overvaluing honesty, which is probably more of my default than to kindness, when I start overvaluing honesty, it's a remarkably refreshing and healthy thing if I'm in sort of relationships with people where they can draw me back into the value of kindness. Because not just because they see the value of being balanced, but because they care deeply about the value of kindness. And they have the eyes to see when I'm living into the downside, even when I'm like, I'm just about the value. It's like, no. You're over focused here, buddy,
Well, and the right, when we diagram this stuff, what we do in the middle is we put the big word in capital letters "and." So it's both honesty and kindness, right? Kindness and the "and" is the huge thing, as opposed to the either or. The "and" is a really, really big deal in the middle of that.
One of the things that I've really liked about polarities is the actual work of filling out the chart. That is, so you've got the upsides of both of your poles, you've got the downsides, and inviting the whole group to speak into filling out what are the upsides of each, what are the downsides of each. And what it does is it gives a chance for every voice to be heard, to understand all the different variables. And then you're in just a much better position to look at the whole playing field, instead of just your own bias, right? Leaning toward kindness or leaning toward honesty. You say, oh yeah, that's right. There are downsides to my tendency too. And we might not get there if we enter into a meeting and our first impulse is, my side has got to, like, we need truth. And you come in, ready to fight for the truth in your meeting, you're going to have this big blind spot for the downside of truth and the upside of kindness. But if you pause long enough to chart it out, there's just, oh yeah, there's a bigger picture than just my tendency, right?
You get a chance to step into somebody else's shoes for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And to think, like, what would be the upsides of this other value that isn't my first choice?
I've done some of these different polarity workshops within Classis contexts and settings, and just playing around with different polarity. And it's interesting. It hasn't happened very often, but once in a while, there might be someone who is just having a really hard time filling out all the spots. Mm-hmm. And it seems like a very, it's just a wonderful opportunity to reflect together on, are you more polarized than you might think, right? Mm-hmm. Like if I value honesty and truth so much that I'm having a hard time filling in the box on the good of kindness or the bad of an over focus on honesty, that in and of itself is a really fruitful place to pause and to wonder, why is it that I have such a hard time seeing any downsides to this thing that I value so much, or the upside to the other side of it? Yeah.
One of the, I think, again, what's going to be helpful for people are more examples. And I wonder if,
sure.
Let's move, I think we've got the honesty, kindness. What are some other polarities you might notice in a congregational setting that maybe people approach as a problem, but you've observed, no, it's more like a polarity to manage?
Yeah, there's a few of them. Oswald and Johnson have a book, Managing Polarities in Congregations, and they identify 8 polarities they say are present in every congregation. And in my work, certainly with congregations, there's a number that come up easily everywhere. Now, one of them is the polarity between tradition and innovation. In other words, what do we need to hang on to, and what needs to stay the same, and what needs to change and be adapted? That's a wrestle. It comes up in worship, clearly. I mean, that's, organs and worship wars, and how we do pastoral care, how we educate our children, all those things. It's what was the way and what needs to be the way, and how do you maintain that conversation? Often it's viewed as a problem. There are folks who will say, we're too traditional, we're stuck in a rut, that's a problem, throw the traditions out, we need to do this. Or there's groups that will say, no, this. But anyway, there are upsides to tradition and upsides to innovation, and there are downsides to too much of both. Ideally, they're related. That's one. Another one is, how do we care for people in the church, nurture the kids and families, and pastor the people in the church? How do we appropriately reach out and pastor the people in our neighborhood and build community and reach out? So we're in-reach, outreach is another interesting one. Either or, no, it's a both and. Another one is we want really good leadership from our pastors, our clergy, and we want really good leadership from the folks in the congregation. So clergy leadership, lay leadership. You can't choose one or the other. We need both, because if the clergy is too strong and the folks in the church underfunction, that shows up as a problem at a given point. If the folks in the church are too strong and deal with a pastor who underfunctions or who can't function well, that's a challenge as well. Who's the leader? It has to be a partnership in the gospel. Those are a few that pop up very quickly. What's interesting is you can find some wonderful examples of polarities, like two opposite things that really belong together. For example, the way Scripture describes the Lord God. He is transcendent, above all, right? This way out there. And he is immanent. He's right inside of us. He dwells in the hearts of the contrite and the lowly. And it's both. It's not one or the other. And somehow when we speak about God, right, we need to speak about that with both of those opposite values that are interdependent. Anyway, so theologically too, this comes up.
I'll throw out another example that you've encountered in your work.
Sure. Since a lot of my work is directed with classes, one of the ones that stands out almost all the time is this tension between business and ministry, right? I hear this quite often. We should be doing ministry. Classes should be about ministry, and we want to do ministry together. And others say, well, it's we got to do the business of Classis. We have to have good governance and good order and, financial statements that are audited. And I see these tensions. They happen within conversation about Classis and what it is and what it should be moving forward. I'm in Classis renewal. So when people talk about how Classis can be renewed, some people are like, well, we need better processes and more defined mandates and, better meetings, more efficiency. And other people are saying there's got to be ministry life happening, and we got to do more together as churches and ministry leaders. And I just can't see a time when we won't value good governance until we don't have it, and a time when we won't say there's got to be a way that this is not just about making sure that the correct T's are crossed and the correct I's are dotted, but about life-giving ministry. So that's one of the tensions I see in a lot of Classis. Another one that I see in Classis is understanding, whether Classis is a meeting or Classis is a network or a group of people, or even if Classis should do things together, or if Classis should be the sort of space where local ministry is supported collectively. And so there's some people who say, all our churches, we should be together, we should do something together, there should be some sort of collective ministry presence. And others will say, no, Classis should do nothing itself as an entity. It's a collection of churches, and the real ministry happens in a local church context, in a local church context alone. And this is just a place where we should encourage one another, pray for one another, those sort of things. And I just see that as sort of an ebb and flow as well. This sense of let's do something together and let's support each individual church in our own ministry. One of the things that I find helpful, I know this isn't a specific example, but one of the ways to get at your own examples of polarities, I think, is to pay attention to, if you hear people asking a question that sounds like this, or even if you can think of framing it yourself, at times I think our Classis, or at times I think our church is too blank. At those times, I wish it were more blank, right? Like sometimes I think our church is too traditional. At those times, I really wish it was more innovative. That's just an example, but in my own local church context where I'm a member, and in I'm sure in each of your own too, we've heard people say, our church is too much like this, and I wish it was like that. Oftentimes, more often than not, I'll even say, what you're going to end up landing on is a polarity. So that's a way to discover our own examples.
That's a very good point. What occurs to me too is that quite often when we get involved in a church, when there's conflict or tension at the leadership level or in the congregation or with a pastor or whatever it is, that often it's polarities that have not been managed well. Often it's about two sides that have stopped the conversation, the ongoing conversation has stopped for some reason, and people have parked on one pole or on the other pole, and instead of engaging with each other and being able to say what's the good in you and what's the good in that, in each point, and what are the flaws in each point, we just stop. And when we stop and we land on one side or the other, we've got an either or. This is where it's at, or that's where it's at. It becomes an either or, and that's just a real challenge. So I wondered, Al, if you would think that for Classis too, if there's a polarity maybe between being task-oriented, getting things done, versus being relationship-oriented, making sure we're getting along. And it's like you'd have to choose between those, but they're both real, and different folks have different, inclinations as to which.
Right, 100%. And Sean, I know you're fishing for more examples, but I'm going to go back to theoretical, but one of the things that the three of us actually talked about that I think led to this video as we started talking about polarities. One piece was thinking, using the metaphor of like a motorcycle, right?
Yeah.
Where we have a road and we're going somewhere, and sometimes to get to that destination, the road never goes straight. So sometimes to get to that destination, the road's going to curve, left, it's going to curve right. You're going to kind of go back and forth. And if you're riding the motorcycle and you just go straight, you're not actually going to get to the destination because you're going to end up in the ditch. So sometimes riding the motorcycle, riding the Polarities, motorcycle to the destination is actually going to require becoming imbalanced to lean one way and then imbalanced to lean another way. And that's where that polarity mapping, it's not static, and it's always going to take moving back and forth. And so the goal in polarity management isn't so much, it's not so much balance, like that you're in the center. It's about progress toward your goal. And the goal always is the thing that you're pointing toward. And to get there, you gotta go back and forth. I mean, this is true. I mean, this is true in Canada as well. I hear it particularly more often in the States, maybe just because it's so defined with, the political right and left. I often hear people talk about, if you take a position on something, it's either a left or a right position. And then there's a quick desire to say, well, if we're hearing a left-sided position, it needs to be balanced with a right-sided position. And there's a sense of, as long as we get both sides, each having their own perspective, that means we're riding nicely down the middle. Yeah. But there is these times where a church, just to use that tradition innovation polarity, for example, there's times where a church to move toward progress, if you think of it as I'm not sure exactly how to say this, so anyone's welcome to correct me after this. But good, God-glorifying worship that allows people to participate effectively, right? If that's our goal, there's going to be times in a congregation's life where it needs to lean hard into innovation. And then there's going to be other times where it needs to lean hard into tradition. And it's not because the church is overly innovative or overly traditional. It's because it cares deeply about that value of worship.
Al, think about your motorcycle example. Even when you are leaning more to the right or more to the left on a curve, you're still in balance.
Yeah, true.
You have to be in balance, or you're gonna crash. And so, but the balance piece doesn't necessarily mean it's all straight line. It's not exactly, 50-50. But over in the long haul, sure, it'll be way closer to that. But there are going to be times, sure, you're moving and shaking. I've got a great segue for you, Sean. And that
Run with it.
A Segway is not quite a motorcycle, but it's like this. One of the polarities that all of us deal with in decision making is the polarity between being prompt and being thorough or careful. When you make a decision, there's often a timely element to it. Like, we need to have this done as soon as we can, but we also have to make sure that we're thinking about all that we need to think about and consider all. So there's promptness and thoroughness, or carefulness. And that's a very interesting thing when it comes to saying, okay, so bringing it back to COVID, right?
Yeah.
What are some of the polarities the council may be managing right now? Well, guess what? That's one of them. It may not be spoken. It may not be identified, but there will be people who feel a pressure to say, we need to make decision about, getting back to normal, quote unquote, some form of normal soon. And others are saying, well, we got to make sure we cover all the angles. What are all the different pieces here and so on? And both are fair. there is a time element because people are getting tired, they're getting exhausted, they start worrying about, are we ever going to come back? And what kind of long-term effect is all this having? And our kids are missing programs and so on. So that's one polarity. You can help me out here, Al, in a minute. I'm thinking of another one is the maybe the individual well-being that we're interested in, and the communal well-being. There's pieces of that. There's there's the personal safety and well-being for life. We're trying to be protective of good health, physical health. And then there's this communal, there's an emotional, the spiritual dimension of being together, right? The communal health. So there's some of those pieces. How do you weigh them out? Yeah, those are a couple of easy. I mean, in terms of just our society, we've been dealing with that polarity all along here too. Protecting life, and then we talk economy, it's protecting livelihood and life in a certain way too, right? How do you balance those things out? And I would come back to the question of fittingness, right? At a given moment, what's the most fitting thing to do? So at the start, like in New York State, for example, it was like, wow, we need to shut this thing down because we've got a huge challenge on our hand. And so they really, that was a problem. The curve getting too high and overcrowding their facilities. That's a problem. How do you solve it? Well, at that point, they had to land on the one pole for a while. But you can't land there forever.
Yeah, let's see if there's other examples of polarities that you might imagine a congregation dealing with around COVID. And then, I don't, just kind of problem it out with me. Upsides, downsides, how might a congregation take that polarity and process it as a group to get further ahead to understanding the whole playing field to make better decisions? And Al, I don't know if you've got one on your mind, or we can just take one that Cecil has thrown out.
I have two that I jotted down. I'll just share them, and we can go back to one Cecil or one of these. Doesn't really matter. But one that I hear people saying, or I can start hearing people saying. I mean, I live in Ontario right now. We can't have any gatherings more than 5 people. It's against Ontario's law. So in a sense, the law makes it easy. I mean, we could talk about a polarity between, following the law and not following the law if you really want to, but
that's not a polarity, by the way.
Well,
there's opposites, but that's not a polarity.
But I mean, when that restriction is lifted, let's imagine, okay? And I know in some of the states and in other parts of Canada, the restriction's been lifted. Or even if you want to, regarding the law, I know separation church and state, in the States. So in that sense, maybe it's a law, but it's not, there's tension around that. But let's say that the restrictions become lifted and it moves into sort of a polarity wisdom description. I can start hearing people talk about, my church is too risk adverse.
Mm-hmm.
And at those times, I wish that, I'm not sure how to phrase that. I'll just say one of the really important things with polarity management, if anyone's, trying to create their own examples, is both sides need to be expressed positively. You can't be like, on one side, we have, the polarity of being smart and being stupid, right? Like that's not, so there's risk averse, or let's say, to state it positively, safety conscious, right? And on the other side, there's a value of, living into an appropriate amount of risk. I'm not sure what word I would give that. But I think that's going to be one that comes out more and more. Maybe you're allowed to meet, but should you meet? And if you do, should everyone wear a mask? Should that just be a mandate? Like, to come into our church building, you have to be wearing a mask. Or how do you space people? All those sort of things. So there's the safety conscious and living with an appropriate amount of risk. That's one. The second is, I see a lot, and maybe this is when people start gathering together, it might be a little bit less so, but there's a desire to recreate what we already have in a different format, right? So like we recreate our worship, Sunday worship experience as close to that Sunday worship experience as possible. That's one value, so that there's a stability to the experience.
Right.
And another value is allowing it to have disruption. Now, some churches don't really have much of a choice, but to what degree can a church live into the disruption really, really intentionally, allow things to just be totally different than what a Sunday morning normally looks like? So how much do you want to hold on to and create stability and recreate as much as possible what a Sunday morning looks like, and how much do you want to do something different during this time that you might not otherwise get a chance to? So those are two that stand out to me.
Let's say that's a version of tradition innovation.
It is really.
It really is. Yeah.
Cecil, do you have any that you want to add, or otherwise we can try workshopping one?
Yeah, no, these are plenty. The thing is, it's one of the challenges is when you try to think of polarities, it's like when you think of any two opposites, you think, oh, they're because they're polar opposites, they're polarity. Not necessarily. They have to be interdependent.
Yeah.
So they have to speak and they have to need each other. Right? So they have to be positive. And you're right, Al, about that. You have to be able to see that both values have a real positive upside, and then they have a downside if they're overly emphasized. But that's a huge part of this. So the tradition innovation piece is a great one. I do think that the one that will be most challenging for churches is the one between I want to value safety and protecting. I want to value the need to live into some risk and live by faith. There's some who would say that's more of a, and there is risk involved, but we need to find ways to express things and not be totally concerned about safety. So,
well, let's run with that one. And I'm going to add this caveat, which is we're a pretty small group, and one of the benefits of doing this as a council is, even with the three of us, we're going to have some blinders to upsides or downsides of certain aspects of this. And that's why these decisions are best made with a big group, like transparently, clearly. But let's start with this safety protecting and then living with appropriate amount of risk. And maybe the first thing to do is there a better way to phrase these to get at that positive language?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I think the emphasizing safety that's good for the one side. I'm not sure how to emphasize the other side. There's just this desire to be together. I mean, there's communal richness in worshiping together, right? It has all those elements that support why we worship together and what are the strengths of it. So maybe the word isn't so important. But there's the value of being together for worship, and there's also the value of being concerned about physical health.
Maybe by the time we end this quick workshopping of it, we'll have the better word.
Yeah, I like that. Well, let's pretend we're a council, right? So we've identified, it doesn't necessarily need to be either or. How do we approach this? What would be your next move, Cecil? I
would say, what I would do is I would map out a diagram, and I'd say on the one hand we've got safety, right? On the other hand we've got worship, communal worship gathering, and I'd say let's start off by naming the really upsides of safety and the upsides of, and then we'd identify the downsides of too much emphasis on one or too much emphasis on the other.
Yeah. All right, so let's run through that. So on the safety side, upsides of safety, people stay alive, right? That's a positive.
We're valuing life and health, and we're affirming the gift of science. I would say we're being considerate of our most vulnerable. Go ahead.
There could be a reputational aspect to it too, by valuing safety. The church is not seen as a reckless entity.
How about upsides on the other pole? So we've got something like I don't know. I'm thinking right now it's togetherness. It's the appropriate amount of risk to convene, to be together.
Mm-hmm.
We value togetherness. I think that's hugely important.
I would also affirm, one of the values I would affirm on that I'm sure lots of people who value this would affirm right away, is life inherently has risk.
Yeah.
Right? So it affirms that. I mean, there's always going to be people, I could easily be one of them, that says, you know, I could get hit driving to the church building. Yeah. You know, so there's always elements of risk in life.
Right. So that's an affirmation of the risk of life. Mm-hmm. Being alive, right? There's inherent risk for sure. Mm-hmm. I would say that the folks who are saying we really need to get full worship back as soon as we can, they're affirming life in a way as well. Yeah. There's some shared values here. There really are.
Mm-hmm. You had alluded earlier to the benefits of being together in terms of our spiritual health, our emotional health, our mental health, right? That's mm-hmm. another thing. So maybe the safety is preserving our physical health, but that togetherness is a way to really experience that spiritual togetherness, the emotional health benefits that come alongside that.
I think that's very true.
There could also be, I don't know if I would argue for or against this, but a sense of independence. Mm-hmm. You know, that, you know, we're here, we're equipped to make some decisions. And so, although I suppose that could be on either side, right? Whether or not. I hear that more on the let's allow life to have some risk. I hear that more from that side, saying there's a sense of independence and we can make decisions.
Yeah.
I think the value here, and maybe help me out, Sean, but I think the value here is just identifying at least 2, 3, 4 things that are really good benefits, the upsides of each one. Because we can't be exhaustive, but we just want to highlight the fact that there are some really good reasons for safety to be of value, and some really good reasons for the coming together to be of value. Yeah. And that's what's important about this.
I think right now, part of the dynamic that makes this hard for churches is we're getting locked into our positions. We've got to open, we've got to stay closed, and you're beginning to almost demonize the other side. And so if you do this exercise together, what it does is, oh yeah, like this person who disagrees with me is not malevolent. Like they've got other values that are at play right now. And then what I also like about this exercise, because it's balanced in terms of there's the 4 quadrants, the upside for each, the downside for each, you're given permission. All right, we've spent some time on the upside. Now we're going to spend some time on the downside. We're not going to stay there, but let's also populate the downside list. And we know we're going to do the downside of your favorite thing, and that will be a little hard for you. We're also going to do the downside of the person you disagree with, you know, favorite poll. So let's do the downsides then right now of the safety poll. I mean, one is the risk of infection, right? I mean, that's the big one on everybody's mind.
Yeah, but that's not a downside, right?
That'd be a downside to the.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah. Of gathering.
Yes.
Right. So go ahead. I don't know which one should we do?
Let's do the downside of safety.
Okay.
All right.
Downside of safety.
Now, one of the tricks, I don't have it written down, but one of the tricks is if you look at the values that we just stated on the risk side, oftentimes those values show up on the over-focused other side.
That's right. Okay, but here, downside of the safety is we're being too protective. Mm-hmm. We think we're going to avoid risk altogether. It's kind of like the hovering parent syndrome, right? That would be a downside. Yeah. Living out of fear.
Mm-hmm. The mental, spiritual, emotional health risks of isolation.
Of isolation, sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Somebody said to me the other day they were not inclined to turn their laptop on Sunday because they were tired of being an observer and wanted to be a participant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, all right, let's do downside of what we've called this living by faith or being together during COVID. This is risk of infection.
Risk of infection.
Yeah.
Risk of infection. I would say, and we'd said on the upside of the other one, a respect for science. It's almost like a cavalier kind of, who cares? If it's too much, that side.
I think witness, like to community, how would it be perceived by the broader community? Would people understand the nuance? Or would they perceive that as you sort of creating a vector for this to spread throughout your community, which would feel threatening to people not a part of your church?
Right. Right. Are we willing to sacrifice something that we really value a lot because we're concerned about the safety of the people in our church, not only, but all the people they will be in touch with? Right.
All right, so we've laid out upsides, downsides. And again, one of the benefits here is you've had to spend some time in the other person's shoes. So we all just have natural tendencies toward one pole or another in almost every polarity. But as churches, we're a mix. And so you've gotten yourself into somebody else's shoes, which again, in this polarized sort of moment, seems like a big win already. But you still have to make a decision. So talk to me about why this is a helpful exercise for a council to be spending, 20 minutes on in their meeting, tonight about whether they should open or close.
One of the things we kind of danced around a little bit, but it's easy for the question to be all about, in this case, say safety, or the question is all about risk. And we debate up and down or up and down. What we really should be debating or having a conversation about as a council, deliberating on, is not about safety or risk, but about that primary value. And how does the real question is not how risky are we going to be or how safe are we going to be, but how much are we going to, how would we define what the overall goal and purpose is based on these two?
Yeah.
Right. So I guess
I got to think for a minute.
I want to integrate this, Al, because I want to say, don't pose it as an either or. Either we think about safety risk or we think about the higher purpose, the shared higher purpose, right? They in polarity mapping, they talk about the greater purpose statement, which is GPS, which is really great for directional, right?
For a motorcycle ride.
Yeah, exactly. So I would want to say, let's talk about safety and risk in view, right, in terms of how do they help us achieve our goal? How do they move us towards that?
Yeah, I wonder, maybe this is putting the two of you on a spot, so I don't have to be on the spot, but what would you name as that greater purpose statement based on the conversation we've just had?
We want healthy. I think a simple one would be we want a healthy congregation. We want a God-glorifying congregation. Let's just say that. That's ultimately the goal of all the people in the church. We want to be the people of God in a way that glorifies Him and blesses the folks around us and ourselves.
With a holistic definition of health, right? So it's not narrowly your physical health.
No,
but
that's right.
It's all encompassing. That'd be one way to get at it. What about you, Al? Now that you've heard us take a stab at it.
Well, I just wonder if there might be value in narrowing it down a little bit more specific, especially if the question is one a council is dealing with, say, do we open next Sunday or don't we open next Sunday, or whatever the question happens to be. In this case, maybe it's not so much being a healthy congregation, it's the purpose of these polarities is to open the doors in such a way that is healthy, right? And what we see is, as we have a conversation about opening the doors, these are two things that tend to be in tension in the conversations that we've been having. And so whether you're someone who is digging your heels in on safety, or you're someone who's digging your heels in on being open to the risk, we both share the goal of wanting to open in a healthy way. And we can both affirm that together.
Yeah, okay. See, and I would say I'd still want a broader goal. I mean, but what I'd say here is that there's a decision to be made, right? And the decision is, you can phrase it this way. You can phrase it, do we open, yes or no? Or you might want to phrase it, if we open, how do we open?
Mm-hmm.
In what way can we open that respects both of these? Because we're in a bit of a dilemma, right? Because there's these are really good arguments being made here, and these are really good points being made here. And how can we do this respectfully? So all that all fits. I just think it's a decision. It's not a problem to solve in a way. It's a decision to make that, and we'll get to this in a second here, but that will be our best judgment in this moment, and that we'll need to review again and revisit and so on.
You're returning us to that greater purpose statement. It seems like a test of your greater purpose statement is, do the people who've kind of found their home in each pole both strongly identify with it as like what's motivating them in this conversation?
Right.
Is that fair to describe it that way? Like, how do you know you have a good GPS?
I think, well, and this is why I think there's a sense in which we're assuming that all of the folks in the church have, and maybe they have never articulated it. Maybe that's the challenge for us, is to actually articulate our higher purpose statement, our greater purpose statement. Yeah. And that is, we want to be a church that glorifies God. Well, how do you do that? Well, you're a church that blesses its members to greater health and stretches them. And you're a church which blesses the community and stretches them to greater health in the best senses of the word, and calls them to, gives them the gospel. You can make it broad enough, I think, that it will clearly be something everybody can adhere to. And you need to be able to say at least that it's not just about whether we're more safety conscious or more willing to risk things. It's about, are we doing whatever it is we're doing so that we can be that kind of church? Yeah. Which I think is calling us to that point and reminding everybody in the conversation that we actually share. That's the page, right? We're on the same page, and we're trying to figure out how to do that.
I'm wondering if you can give some more reflection on why this is a helpful process to consider decisions as contextual. So what I'm thinking here is, this might be the right decision for this church, this moment right now, but because we've done this mapping, it might help us make other decisions in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I can take a start at that, Al. Just pitch in whenever you like. I think it's really helpful. Well, thinking about polarities does a number of things. When you think about the shared purpose, you are basically saying, guess what? We're united. We are together in this. This is not about us and them. This is about us figuring this out together. We have some different views. Secondly, there are, we're different. And what we're doing is we're owning our differences. We're doing it together. We're not just going to say differences, this is right, that's wrong, you got to be here or there. We are these people, part of the body, part of being in the body of Christ. The body is made up of a lot of different systems. They all start with one cell, and they're different systems. And in the body, the Apostle Paul would say, in 1 Corinthians, he'd say, differences are essential for life, for vitality. And they're not just to be tolerated. No, they're that you need differences in your body. So that's part of what we're at, and that's a really good thing here. And the second, or the last thing about polarities and councils is that because you can never eliminate a polarity, there will always be the tradition, innovation, honesty, kindness. Those kinds of things will always be there. The decision you make today is the decision you make today. And when your church changes, when the culture changes, when the situation changes, you'll have to evaluate which lean you need to make. So what I love about this is that if we as pastors or deacons or elders, council people, if we think of ourselves as the answer people, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to come up with the correct answer, the right answer. This is not about necessarily having the correct answer or the right answer. This is about saying wisdom, our discernment, leads us this way right now. It's the best we can imagine to do right now. And we may be wrong. We're going to review it. So there's courage in making this decision because we don't know what the future brings. And there's humility in it because we're going to review it and we're going to come back to it. So there's humility that says, I may make some mistakes, and hopefully we'll bless our leaders with some room to make mistakes. But it's provisional in that sense. And I love it for that reason. Yeah.
I think I'll just add that when a decision does get made, it also creates more opportunity for buy-in when it can be framed around that goal or that purpose. Because you don't say something like, we've decided that we're not going to start in-person worship, or we're not going to start it in this way, or however it happens. But this is what we've decided because we want to be safe, right? Because then, if that's a tension you see happening, then you're just affirming one side of it. But instead you say, because we want to be this type of church community. And to be this type of church community, we've determined that a signpost of that right now, or a mile marker of that right now, is to land here. And a mile marker of that in a month or 2 or 3, it might be over here. But we're continuing to follow the path toward that goal that I think we can all share together. And that's why we're making this decision. You can disagree with if that's where we need to land, but hopefully we can all agree that the goal isn't to be safe or to live into an appropriate amount of risk. The goal is to be that type of church that we all want to be.
What do you think about a council like sharing the chart with their congregation? Sort of, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, but to be able to be transparent about, hey, we weighed some of the upsides, downsides. This is the bigger, greater purpose that we're driving for. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Oh,
very much in favor.
I'm very much in favor of it too. What it does, you know what this does is it helps us to listen to each other. Yeah. I think that's the beauty of it, is that you start saying, okay, it's not just what I'm thinking here, but guess what? There's some folks there that have some really important values that share they're with me in the purpose, and they have a different approach, and they bring up things that I wouldn't automatically think of, and it's more important to them than it actually is to me. But we listen to each other, and I think that makes us richer and thicker. It's more complicated, but it also takes some of the pressure off, because we say, look, let's do the best we can, and then let's just promise to review this, however long down the road it is.
And sometimes it helps people to be able to locate themselves, and for a council to be able to locate someone, because someone might say, you made that decision. It was a terrible decision, because why aren't you taking safety more in mind? And it then creates a sort of space to say, wow, I value that complaint so much because it helps enrich this polarity map that we've developed. And so let's put this on the downside of safety to help flesh this out. And as we move forward in decisions, your complaint provides us the sort of thickening that we were hoping for all along. So, that may sound manipulative to a degree, but I don't think it is.
Doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be. As long as you actually listen to it and ensure that when you help someone locate themselves and their position, that you actually still do listen to it and you pay attention to it and say, that is a valuable insight. And I'm so glad that you spoke up.
Leaders, when I think about the leaders in my congregation, for example, where I'm attending now, I don't want them to be compelled to think they have to come up with the right answer. that is the one that's going to, be the right answer. But I do want them to ask all the questions that they need to be asking, and to say, what are all the things we need to consider and keep in mind here? And once they ask all those questions, well, then we'll trust that the Spirit will lead them as they discern together, and as they work hard at saying, okay, how do we balance it out in this moment? Because it is a really, if you want to talk about transitions and all the changes and all the fluid things that we're going through, it's pretty wild. It varies from city to city and state and province and country, and we're all trying to make this work together. So we need to give each other some extra flex room to sort this out, it seems to me.
Well, all right, let's say you've got a council meeting tonight. The agenda is COVID reopening is kind of all over the agenda. What's kind of your summary of how polarity analysis can help this conversation go better? And Cecil, we'll start with you.
Okay. Well, this is a little bit of review then from what actually we've been talking about. I would say, number one, it helps us ask questions and wonder about what are all the angles that we need to consider here. What are all the values that are in play? And are there some competing values that hold each other in tension? And are we thinking about that as we consider our way forward? This isn't about all one or it isn't all or nothing, all open or shut entirely down. This might be about saying, we can open the restrictions we have. Like, for example, in Alberta right now, we're allowed to have up to 50 people gathering for worship, or 1/3 of your congregation, whichever is less. It's an interesting restriction. And then you got to be, socially distanced. We were not to sing in public together right now. So you have to weigh that out and say, okay, how do we go about that? Let's think about whether it's worthwhile to open up for worship right now, or whether we would, maybe some churches would say, we're going to have 3 services, and that way we can have small groups at each service. Finding worship leaders and pastors for all those services might be a bit of a challenge, but that's a way to think. There's all these different options, and then you have to weigh them out and make a decision. I think the polarity context allows you to see how complex this is. And number 2, it allows you to recognize that the decision you make will be your best effort at being wise and what is the most fitting in this moment. But it will be provisional, because 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 8 weeks down the road, you may have to have the same conversation and revisit the decision and maybe reconfigure it. And I think it'll help by taking the pressure off, I think.
Mm-hmm. How about for you? The agenda's reopening tonight. How can polarity analysis help us have this conversation better?
Right. I think without getting into all the technical pieces like we've been talking about, I think where I would land with it is simply, it can help the conversation, because instead of allowing ourselves to lean into a fear or loss-based decision process, it pushes us into a complementary values-based decision process. And the more we can move away from trying to hold on to what I'm afraid of losing to here's what I value, and I value this with enough strength to be able to also recognize and affirm the value of the tension of the thing that it's in tension with. And both coming at it in a sense of strength to be able to hold both of those just makes ownership better. It makes the conversation better. It makes discernment better. It makes listening better. And it just makes a better decision. You may land on the same decision, but people are going to buy into it differently. You're going to be able to explain to the congregation why you made that decision in such a way that creates space for them to enter into it, irrespective of their position. So there's just a win all over it. One of the things, just to, and I know Cecil, you were kind of getting at this, working through the polarities does not absolve the council of making a decision, right? That's easy to think, well, we're just going to talk about it and like, you know, play this game of, you know, putting these different values up and the, you know, but I mean, at the end of the night, you can expand your decision opportunities and possibilities. You can say, what about this and this and this and this? And, you know, it doesn't have to be just all open or all closed. But at the end of the night, you do have to make a decision at some point. And that decision is going to pull together all those pieces. And yeah, you can't do everything, right? But it does allow you the space to show that you took a lot into account and that it's simply one piece of a journey for this time in this place. So.
Earlier, you said something about how tightly we hold things, and what you just described, it's like we want to make this conversation based on values, which we're holding even more tightly and
right.
than ever, but we can hold our decisions more loosely.
Right. Yeah.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah.
One of the big payoffs for me of going through an intentional process like this is one of the things that councils are going to find is they're going to make the wrong decision sometimes, right? I mean, it's part of making decisions. It's part of leadership. But going through an activity like this builds the trust in the room. People feel heard. They don't feel disrespected. And so what that does is it increases the trust so that when you made the wrong decision, right, there's less likely to be that backbiting, the blaming. It's like, no, we were in that together. Like we heard each other, we spoke together. And my sort of assumption about churches right now is trust is the thing that everybody needs more of right now, because we're entering into this phase. So much is unknown, uncharted. We're having to make decisions, and we know that we're going to make wrong ones. So if there's trust in the community, so much more can be accomplished.
You need to hear all the different voices.
Yeah.
Right. And anyway, it's great stuff. You're reminding me of Patrick Lencioni's stuff on for everybody to weigh in, then you can have buy-in. Right? If we've all had a chance to weigh in, you can buy in and all that stuff. It's just totally true. The trust is huge. I think.
Well, go ahead, Al.
Well, I know we're coming to a close here, and you know, bless everyone who's made it this far with us, right? But one of the pieces that has occurred to me that really could have been spoken anywhere through this is, especially if you're facilitating this discussion, especially in a highly polarized environment, or if you yourself are someone who values one side of it very deeply, the tension that you're going to have to deal with is letting go of arguing with it, right? So your goal in this is not to make your position known. Your goal in this is not to try and figure out what the right answer is. Your goal of it is to make sure that everyone's perspective, no matter how agreeable or disagreeable you find it, shows up accurately and generously in this polarity mapping. So, you know, I've seen this happen. You start talking about the downsides of something or the positives, and you're like, well, we're just here right now. But you try and keep that group in there, and pretty quickly, I mean, someone says, well, we're safe, you know, it's safety, so it's this. We're like, yeah, but, you know, and it's like, well, can this wait? Or do you really need to say it so that and go ahead and say it, and we'll not even address it, not even talk about it. We'll just put it down here in this box because you're just kind of getting ahead, and that's okay. But we don't need to have a conversation about it. We'll just write it down because you can't wait. And then we'll go back here and talk more about it. So that's just one of those pieces. Is in a polarized environment, when these things are in tension, that tension is going to bubble over in people not being able or willing to stick with, you know, working one box at a time.
Yeah.
That's okay. Just work with it. The goal is to fill all the boxes, even if it doesn't happen as cleanly as you want.
Yeah. Oh, exactly. I think just in general, if you're in leadership in churches and you have a polarity at work that you're dealing with, whether it's very formally, you know, or kind of informally, the challenge for you as a leader is you will probably have a default leaning one way or the other. And your challenge as a leader is to ensure that the upsides of the opposite position from what that you will gets a fair shake.
Yeah.
That's real leadership. That's I think being very helpful.
Hey, that's a good word to end on. Cecil, Al, I really appreciate your time and your insights. Hope this is helpful for congregations weighing these things. We're going to put some links beneath the video to connect people to the book that this is based on. And we'll also put up a sample of the polarity map that we put together during our conversation. So thanks so much for being with us. Talk to you later.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.